I'm going to introduce Mr. Rob Corby, former mayor of the village of Pittsford. Please give him a big, 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 big hand. There is absolutely nothing that Rob does not know about trees, grass, plants, animals, properties, wetlands. So here he goes.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming out tonight. And I'd also like to acknowledge Dick Dennison, a former village trustee who was one of my mentors and one of those legends that did so much for the village and our community. I'm going to give an overview tonight of kind of the past, present, and hopefully the future of this unique 30-acre area that our community has managed to preserve. And the incident of a community our size having an area, a natural area this large, close to the walkable heart of our community is extremely rare. For the last 25 years, it's a project that I worked on with various town leaders and other people to make this come to fruition. And I'll get into that in a little bit. And this is the area, just to give you an overview of what we have here. This is North Main Street, Pittsford Forest areas right here. This is the West Shore Railroad Bridge. Here's the Monroe Avenue Bridge. This is Talbot's. The green area there, that is the town Erie Canal Nature Preserve, which is approximately 22 acres. There's actually a bridge between this parcel and that parcel that's not shown on this map. So this is all where the new Frog Trail goes through and links up to the Auburn line. This area here, which says Village of Pittsford, is the Arboretum. There's basically the top 10 acres, which is just above where my finger is the area that has been reserved as the Village Arboretum. There's about 2.5 acres at the bottom, including some canal lands, which is the existing DPW yard. And I'll talk more about the specific features of this a little bit later on. I wanted to give you an overview tonight of kind of the history of our area, beginning with the geology.
Yes, stand in front of this, because that actually gets you both.
Thank you for reminding me. Am I in the right place?
Great.
Okay, all right. Underneath all of us, all of Western New York, hundreds of millions of years ago was shallow sea. The depth of the sea varied depending on how much sediment was coming. There was an ancient Himalaya chain of mountains in what is now Massachusetts. And as those eroded, they eroded into the shallow sea. And so all the bedrock underneath us, siltstone, limestone, shale, is all the sediment from those ancient mountains. And depending on how deep the sea was, determined what the bedrock is. Under Pittsford, we have an outcrop of limestone, which is why we have the caverns under the village. And if you look at where the canal is, basically south of the canal, the bedrock is fairly close to the surface, and there's an outcrop. And actually, if you go right there on the canal, in this time of year, you can see some of the shale outcropping, and that's one of the few places that you can actually find Pittsford Eurypterids. The Pittsford shale was deposited 450 million years ago. Now, because after that deposit was made, due to plate tectonics, Europe smashed into North America and folded the mountains in Pennsylvania. In our area, the effect is that the strata, instead of being horizontal, dipped slightly to the south. So before the 3 phases of glaciation, when you have strata that dip to the south, often what happens is the harder strata, the limestone and the dolomite, the more resistant to erosion, become outcrops, and they form these escarpments or cuesta, which are kind of these ridges with a steep north slope and a gentle south slope. And the strata in our area actually every mile they dip or they go down 50 feet to the south. So as you move from the Lake Ontario south, there's 3 of these major escarpments. the Niagara, which is expressed obviously in the falls in downtown Rochester, the Onondaga, which is expressed in waterfalls like in Honey Eye Falls. And if you go across to Buffalo, there's a whole string of falls in Leroy and several other places all across the state. And the furthest south one is the Portage Escarpment, which is represented by the falls at Letchworth, but also by the rise in the topography that happens in the Finger Lakes. Now, prior to glaciation, there were the river system was very different here, and there were a number of streams that followed the northern slope of these escarpments. One example where that still occurs is if you look at where Oatka Creek goes east-west through the town of Wheatland before it goes up the Buttermilk Falls up the Onondaga Escarpment. Most of the pre-glacial topography has been erased because 3 ice sheets really changed the topography here. And in Monroe County in particular, almost everything that you see in terms of topographical relief, the hills are the result of glaciation. The old Genesee Valley followed it where it is now, and then it took a 90-degree turn through the town of Mendon, just north of the Onondaga Escarpment, and then made another 90-degree turn and followed the Irondequoit Valley into Lake Ontario. That was blocked by glaciation, and then several parts of it were filled in, and now Honey Eye Creek follows what was the old valley and parts of Mendon. That's just one example. So as the glaciers retreated, and the last stage of glaciation happened between 75,000 and 22,000 years ago, and there were 3 meltwater lakes that happened in Monroe County, Lake Scottsville, Lake Dawson, and Lake Iroquois. The one we're concerned with is Lake Dawson, because the shoreline of Lake Dawson was at 480 feet above sea level, which is approximately the level of where the canal is today. I know I live here and my house is 508 feet above sea level, which is a little bit above this. But basically, the reason the canal makes these funny curves through eastern Monroe County is it was following the contours. And this happened to be the lake shoreline. The other thing that means is south of the canal in Pittsford, we have rich, heavy glacial loam. Some of the richest soil in Western New York, as you know, is in the town of Pittsford. And in many parts of the village, that means there's underground streams, wet basements. It's frustrating because a lot of people struggle with that. If you go north of the canal, you can dig about 70 feet down and it's all sand, rich, loamy sand. And that's why the canal is there. That's also part of the reason why Pittsford developed early on into a suburb, because the farmland in the northern part of the town wasn't that great. That's why U of R made a deal with Oak Hill to relocate the golf course here, and much of that farmland was abandoned in the early 20th century because it just wasn't as productive for cash crops as land to the south of the village was and continues to be today. So this area that we're talking about here was a farm. Through this was a little 4.5 acre. That always was a separate parcel with a variety of different owners. The larger part was owned by Christian Hoff until into the early 20th century. The land was leased. Eventually, the village acquired it. In the 1930s, the village built a sewer plant here in this round office building in Ted Spall's office park that was built in the 1980s. The reason that's round is it was built, the foundation is the old irrigator from the sewer plant. When I was a kid, one of the things that you would see kids from Sutherland do is they would ride around on that irrigator as the effluent went through a gravel bed and was filtered. But probably Andy remembers that also. In any case, this area, back in the early 1960s, as the town started to experience suburban growth, the town and the village both adopted typical suburban zoning codes that were in place until we changed them in the last, both the town and the village have updated their codes since then. But this area was looked at as an industrial area, and because in the 1950s and 60s, the canal was still seen as just an industrial corridor, there wasn't much value placed on it. So this area was all zoned industrial. And it was updated when I think Bill Carpenter was the chair of the village planning board. They finessed that a little bit to make it more of a warehouse office district, but it still would have been a terrible misuse of our canal frontage to have that sort of land use there. There were several proposals. There was one proposal for a 7-story hotel and a warehouse facility there that would have conformed to the zoning. And the only reason it didn't occur is because Monroe Avenue or the New York State Department of Transportation would allow access on that section there. What's great about this section of the canal and in general, what sets the village of Pittsford apart is even though it's in a suburban area, unlike every other suburban village in Monroe County, the commercial areas don't run into the village. You still know when you approach the village from any direction, you still feel the historic sense of you're coming into a village. And the canal is obviously an important part of that. And back in the late 1990s and early 2000s, the village and town did a local waterfront redevelopment project together. And the essential mission of that was to preserve the green character of the canal. And that's our comprehensive plan, a shared document between the town and the village, which is committed to keeping the historic rural appearance of our canal corridor as you move through the town. And that's one of the reasons I think our section of the towpath is the most heavily used of any section in the state, is because even though we're a suburban town, the towpath is a very scenic corridor and it's a beautiful walk any time of year. So this area was left here because essentially landlocked, and much of it is wet. And what's interesting, I had historic photographs, it's grown wetter over the years as the area around it has developed, and it sort of has served as a sponge to soak up that land. If you look at the top, you can see sort of a white dotted line that goes to the left side of the photograph. That's a creek that actually drains the wetlands in there. There's some natural springs in this area, and in many parts of Pittsburgh, north of the canal, because there's this limestone escarpment south of the canal, there are still springs in the area. As you know, historically, Pittsford was located here because over here was the big spring that had a pond, which is now occupied, that where the pond was is now occupied by the canal itself. But we have the same thing over here. So about 20 years ago, I started talking to Bill Carpenter about possible ways to save this. And we talked about, a town park here and different ideas. And at that time, I contacted my cousin, Andy Smith, over there, who came out, I think it was a weekday, that we actually, in the middle of winter and in fairly heavy snow and boots, we tromped around the project because prior to the trail that is there now, it's a very difficult area to traverse because there's wetlands and creeks and stuff that run all through it. And unless you're willing to get your knees knee deep in mud, it's a hard area to traverse. But we walked around it and we actually sort of went around the perimeter to identify how large the wetland was. I had no idea prior to that point how big it was. We calculated, I think it was about 10 acres, if I remember correctly at the time. So there's a big section right above where my thumb is, and then it extends up to the northwest into what looks like a wooded area. There's more wetland in there. And so that really hatched the idea that maybe this was an area that we could protect. We did a comprehensive plan in 2004. The consultant really wanted to put housing and, neo-traditional, a new village neighborhood there, which the committee was kind of lukewarm about it, but somehow that got into the comprehensive plan. So when we redid our comprehensive plan a few years ago, we did the most complete survey that the village has ever done of every resident on a variety of issues, including everything from 75 Monroe to the services that village residents receive. It was really quite comprehensive, and it was sent to every adult resident in the village. So if you were a couple, you got 2. If you had an adult child in your house, you got another survey for them. And the response rate was really off the charts. What we found from that was that over 80% of village residents, oh, thank you, I'm stepping out of the box. Over 80% of our residents wanted to see this kept as a forever wild. For over 30 years, people have used it. Up until about 1980, it was used as a brush dump. The village, the lawn debris that was collected from the village was landfilled there. And that the capacity of that was reached, and it was capped, and nothing has been put in since that time. What's really interesting is when I was a kid, most of this area was still open. This area, there was still a farmhouse here, and there was a field. There was one cultivated field that somebody was farming at that time. And the rest of it was basically an open brush dump. There was one hedgerow up in the northwest quadrant. There's an old section of old growth woods which has survived. And there's also 2 areas with spruce plantations that were right here and there that were planted in the 1930s when the sewer plant was built as a WPA project. That was abandoned in the 1980s when the village became part of Monroe County Pure Waters. In any case, I spoke to town supervisor Bill Smith, and he was still formulating ideas what to do with this property that the town had acquired. At one point, it was considered for a new recreation center as a possible location for that, or for the library. Those were discarded as those other projects moved forward, but there was still an idea what could be done here. And so working on a committee, we came up with a current plan for the Erie Canal Nature Preserve with the frog trail that really is, Susan Steele is the landscape architect from the Village of Fairport, who did an amazing job locating the trail where it really highlights the best features through the property. I need to glue my feet to the ground here. And a very successful project. Part of that hasn't been completed yet is there's a 150-year-old barn that was taken down on Calkins Road that, with the help of historic Pittsford, has been stored in the Charles Zorno barns that the town owns on West Jefferson Road, just outside the village. The plan is that will eventually be reconstructed here and used as a shelter that will be available, just like the shelter is in Kings Bend Park. And it's been sited in a great location where it will have great views of the canal. And it should be a tremendous addition when that part of it is complete. And it'll be a historically compatible building with that part of the canal. So that part worked out very well. After we finished our comprehensive plan, the village board in 2020, I believe, July 2020, voted to designate the 10 acres of the village DPW property permanently as parkland, meaning that any future administration can't undo that without approval of both houses of the state legislature, making it highly unlikely. And that was our intent. Clearly, it was the intent of residents to preserve this area. It's been used informally for 30 years by many people in the north part of the town. And over the next year, we formulated the idea of the village arboretum. The reason we thought of this is because the village has a fairly small budget, and a project of this size is a fiscal challenge. With an arboretum, number one, we're living in a time when invasive species are a major threat to our native wildlife, both our plants, our understory plants, and our wild birds and other things that live in our areas. Things like all these ground covers that are creeping in that you see, like garlic mustard, Japanese knotweed. There's a whole bunch of them, and they just seem to get worse each year. Secondly, the way, and this is something that I learned from Margot Fass, is that kids don't grow up today. They don't experience the same things I grew up, growing up on a farm, playing in the mud and getting dirty and, collecting tadpoles and all of that. And given this project's location, there's a great educational opportunity to show people what is our native ecosystem and how does it function. And because this is a disturbed landscape, meaning right now it's, except for the northwest quadrant, it's volunteer secondary growth that has come in. Some of it is fine. Some of it is pioneer native species like cottonwood poplar. Then there's invasive ailanthus, some of it which we've already removed. But it will need some tending and planning to become something like the lomwoods, which is an old growth woods over time. And the idea was incrementally each year by successive plantings of native trees, the first which was done a year ago. This could be achieved at a fairly minimal expense for the village, and it could be enhanced by other things. There's an existing trail network that's already there that circumvents the property and actually runs through it. I think there's an opportunity for a new trail. Go from here to link to the frog trail over there. So there's a list of things, benches, bluebird boxes, bat houses that will enhance it. I think some signage to explain what's there right now and what's going on. The spruce plantations that were planted in the 1930s, those are aging out. And so eventually they're getting at the end of their life. They will be supplanted by deciduous trees. We can help that process along by planting trees. And I made a list earlier this morning of common native trees. And these are trees that will grow today. Things like native American chestnut, unfortunately, we don't yet have a cultivar that's blight resistant. But yellow poplar, white oak, eastern red cedar, sugar maple, northern red oak, black walnut, black cherry, American beech, red maple, eastern white pine, basswood, American elm, hackberry, sassafras, redbud, eastern hemlock, sycamore, river birch, black gum, black locust, sweet gum, shagbark, hickory, butternut, black oak, bur oak, pin oak, and Kentucky coffee tree. That's 28 trees right there. 28 trees right there that are native that could be planted here, and some of them we planted a year ago. Last spring, Jim Engel, a native plant horticulturist with a nursery in Canandaigua, planted 130 trees and 90 shrubs. And unfortunately, there's a meadow in the middle there that we were going to overplant with native meadow plants like they've done at the Tinker Nature Park in Henrietta. And that unfortunately was stopped by a village official. But that still would be the ideal plan to help this area recover. And there's unfortunately several areas where we have invasive knotweed. That is one of the most noxious native plants or non-native plants that we face. It's a shrub that expands by tubers underground, and it's a multi-year project to eliminate it. You literally either have to pull it out of the ground or smother it by covering it with plastic or something so it can't get light. And they did one phase of remediation a year ago, but it's crept beyond the plastic that was laid down, and more work is going to have to be done to actually get rid of it. I've had it in my backyard, and I've been pulling it every year for the last 5 years. I think I may have finally gotten rid of it, but it took about 5 years for me to get it completely out of my yard. So, so that's the hope going forward. I know at both the town nature park and at the Arboretum, there's a number of invasive plants that need to be managed. I think in the town wetland, the biggest threat is Phragmites. Phragmites is that high grass looking thing that grows like cattails, but it's taller and it has fronds on the top of it. That is, it will go in and take over and it has no value for native plants. You see it throughout Minden Ponds Park now, it's everywhere. But because these areas are fairly contained, it could be managed, and a Frog House has been working with the town of Pittsford on hopefully some grant funding to help with a management project for that. At the Arboretum, there's still some Ailanthus left that needs to be removed. The Japanese knotweed is probably the biggest challenge. And then the other thing is the meadow area now is there are some grasses there, but there's a lot of garlic mustard and other just swallowwort, which is another, swallowwort it's a waxy looking, has kind of diamond shaped leaves. You see it everywhere. It's all through, again, through Minden Ponds Park. But I think it could be contained here. And if it was done with some work every year in cooperation with groups like the Garden Club, which is pledged to support for the Arboretum, it's a very achievable project that can be done at a minimal cost to the taxpayer. And I think the process as it transforms over several years is also an educational process to show the community what can be done and how we can manage invasive species. The DEC across the state is just now sort of ramping up an educational effort to make people aware of how toxic these invasive species are and what a threat they can be to watersheds and wildlife. So I guess that's a summary. So could I take some questions? Yes.
Can you show us, where are these frog ponds?
But they're right in a row, right in that area right there.
What was the history with Ward Treating and Ward Scientific?
This building right there, that was Ward Scientific. They manufactured kits for biology classes, including supposedly they grew aquatic plants in those ponds. They also obviously provided frogs for dissection and fetal pigs and things like that.
Is there a trail that you can, where's the trailhead?
If you go to the Monroe Avenue access to the canal trail, if you just go under the bridge a little bit, there's a very nice sign here and you'll see the entrance. And you can actually, it links with the trails that go through the Arboretum. So if you go to where it says B on the map, there's an entrance to the Arboretum and then you can walk around the Arboretum as well.
And where can you park?
You can park right here. You can also park over by the pickle factory. And you can take the Auburn Line Trail where that orange line begins and you can come in and access it that way as well.
Or Del Monte?
Or Del Monte. You can also, if you come to the Village DPW, if you walk along the towpath trail, walk in behind the garage and there's an entrance to the Arboretum right there.
Oh, you think what buildings, what would be a reference point?
If you go in on the Auburn Line Trail from behind.
On the Auburn Line Trail.
Okay, if you go on Grove Street and where the parking lot is, there's a mini storage facility. This parallels in behind that. And when you get to here, you'll see a sign and there's a trail that will come down here and that's a frog trail and you can follow that down to the canal. You can also, the trails through the Arboretum go around, there's a circuit. You can make it a loop, a nice loop, and it's a great walk on a spring day.
Is it all marked?
The Arboretum trails are not yet marked. The Frog Trail is well marked. You can't miss it. Any other questions? Yes.
Are children allowed to run around or should they stay on trail? On the path?
Well, they might get muddy in certain places in the wetland. Yeah, the question is, can kids run around in the answer is yes. And there's a number of areas where you'll see wildflowers. The other thing the town has done here is they created a native wildflower garden here that at the end of August, when those flowers in bloom, is really spectacular. Yes,
And you have dogs on that trail?
all the trails are dog friendly, yes. You keep your dog on leash, but there's many dogs you'll see. I can't imagine I ever walked through there where I didn't run into another dog other than my own. So it's a popular place for that. Yes, Dick?
My recollection is there used to be a lot of deer there.
There still are a lot of deer. In fact, one point a few weeks ago, I saw 7 turkeys crossing the trail in front of me. I often see deer there. I've seen fox there as well. There are 2 pairs of ravens that have their nests in this area, and you're likely to see that. You will hear them probably before you see them, but they are big, interesting birds to observe. Any other questions? The other thing, if you go there now, you'll see the first signs of spring. Skunk cabbage, the skunk cabbage is just starting to come out. And the other thing you might see is this is the season of year that salamanders breed. And so you may see migrating salamanders. I was just reading an article recently near one of the Finger Lakes. They were thinking of setting up a salamander trail because this is the time that they migrate and are active, which is, I never realized that. For anyone, if you want to understand how wetlands function, I highly recommend this book. It's called A Swamp Walker's Journal.
Can you hold it this way?
Yep, it's a Swamp Walker's Journal. The author is, if I can read it, is David M. Carroll. And it basically takes you through the life cycle in a year of what happens in a riparian, areas adjacent to water, all the things that live there. It's an eye opener and it's a great read. Any other questions?
Yeah, how long is it to get in miles or whatever from A to down to the Erie Canal?
I think from A to the canal is probably about a quarter of a mile. It's not that far. It's only, this whole area is about 33 acres. So it's not, for comparison, the Longwoods is about 12 acres. Windswood, which is the town property with trails near Nazareth College, that is about 10 acres. And the largest old growth woodlot in Monroe County is the Hopkins Woods on Hopkins Farm. And that's about the same size as this whole area. And that's an old growth woodlot with a lot of majestic 200-year-old trees still standing. Yes, hand in the back.
So if we were interested in volunteering or gathering volunteers together to help manage the invasives or plant or whatever, who do we contact?
You could.
Wait, can you?
Yeah, the question is if you would like to help in the effort to manage invasives and with the volunteer work that's needed in the Arboretum, who to contact. You could contact me, you could contact Margot Fass of Frog House, and Sue Julian, who is a member of the Pittsford Garden Club. Because all 3 organizations are partnering. There's also the Friends of the Robert C. Corby Arboretum.
Yeah, go next to him.
Yeah.
Sue will tell you about the garden club and what they're doing.
Well, we're working with Rob and the Frog House, the garden club. We're rather small now due to COVID, aging out of our group. A lot of the members are older and can't do the physical work any longer. So we're looking for volunteers to join the garden club to help do this. It's not that much work, really. You can do it when you want to do it. We meet monthly. We talk about things like the Arboretum, any ways you can help. So we have brochures in the back.
Now, one of the things I would like to give credit to is village resident Mike Reynolds, almost single-handedly with help from a few of us, weeded the trees that were planted last year to keep them healthy. And one of the things that will need to be done this season is that operation will have to be repeated several times through the season. There's cages that have been put around the young saplings to protect them from the deer, but they do need to be especially if we have another wet summer like we did last year, they need to be weeded. So that's probably the highest priority of the work that needs to be done this season.
Now, I haven't established with Andy yet as to whether his presentation will just tell us what to do or whether we're going to put on hip boots and go out and do some of it.
Well, I figured we'd start with some suggestions, and that could lead into some actions.
Okay, so this is a long project, the wetlands and the invasives in that. This year, I think the best we could do is learn how to do it because all the weeding has to be done in early spring. And then you have to wait at least a year before you can sow native rye or something like that, some kind of ground cover. And then you can start planting the native plants. So we're going to, I guess there won't be that much hands-on work this summer, but for the long term, we got to get those ponds working again. So volunteer. And I have a little teeny frog pond, 2 little teeny frog ponds at a frog house. So you're welcome to come practice getting your feet wet. They're very small. They're about this big each. Wendy?
So there are no underground streams, no currents, there's nothing that can be used to oxygenate the ponds. There's no way.
The way the drainage works right now is there's a natural spring that feeds this drainage in here, and there's another wetland that doesn't quite show that's kind of up in this area. The primary drainage is what's happened is there's artificial drainage from storm sewers that all comes into here, and then there's a culvert that takes it underneath the Auburn Trail, and that begins the stream through here. There's additional drainage that comes into here, so I think it needs to be studied to figure it out. There's a fair amount of water. I've never seen this creek when it's completely dry. There always seems to be water that flows through the area. So, I guess that's a question that needs to be answered.
Yes.
Take me through a loop on that, if you would. If I'm starting where you say you are here,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm going from there to A, how would I get back there? Not taking the same, not turning around. And
Sure.
going back there.
So if you started here, you follow this trail up through the Erie Canal Preserve, and then you have several choices. You could, number one, you could take the Auburn Trail down here and then follow Village Lane back to the Towpath Trail. That's one circuit. You could also come in here to the Arboretum. You could take this trail here and goes over here. It also makes a loop and then comes out here. And then again, you could come back on the Towpath Trail. So there's like several different routes that you can take that would circumvent and make a loop walk through the area.
Are there maps available?
The village is talking about getting this area surveyed with a map. It's an area, it's a topic that is currently on the agenda of the village board, and they're discussing it.
It's not easy to get lost.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to come out on the street though.
Yeah, you will. You won't get lost. What's nice about it is, especially after the leaves come out, the area is big enough that you'd never believe it's hard to believe there's that much open land back there. But you always come out and, there's developed areas all around it. It really is a little island of wilderness right in the center of our village. It's pretty cool.
There's turtles too. If you go in some of the ponds, they come out there on the logs as you walk over the bridge that's in there. If you look to your left, there's frequently turtles. On the
They'll be
logs.
sunning themselves on a hot summer day. It's pretty neat, Yes.
This project information on the village website for residents to be able to look at.
Not at the current time. I think that's a good suggestion though, is we ought to do a write-up and propose that the village board put it on the website. That's a great idea. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to point out is one of the reasons generally around wetlands, you want a 500-foot buffer to provide habitat for all the things that live part of their life cycle in the water, like green frogs, and the other part that live in the trees. And this area as an upland forest area really provides has a symbiotic relationship with the wetlands. So really the two pieces go together as one ecosystem.
In 2014, the DNC had an article about, come back here, about. In 2014, the DNC had an article about a possible development up there. And there were like 20 or 40 lots or houses. Please talk about that.
Yeah, there was a proposal to have a subdivision there with about 40 houses there. And 40.
Are they going to cut down the hill or what?
In doing that, they would have had to fill in the wetland. I don't think it really was a viable proposal, but that was kind of the old way of thinking. And I'm glad our community has come around to preserve this, because I think, there's so much value, in just to get into a green area as a way to deal with stress. And it's just such a healthy experience to have that, and have it linked up with a canal and the town's trail system is an incredible asset for our community. And I think it's something, there's so many people that have worked to make this happen. I'd like to give credit to both Bill Carpenter and Bill Smith, who were instrumental in preserving this area, and the other village board members that worked with me to make this happen, because it really is a unique asset for Pittsford.
Can you ask the listeners on if any of them?
Yeah, does any of the listeners on Zoom, do any of you have questions that we could address?
Here's one. Can you repeat the book author's name?
Oh, the book author, yes. Yep.
David.
It's David M. Carroll, and there's 2 R's in Carroll.
Is it available in winter time to walk it?
Yes, you can walk it all year round.
Is it
Yes.
plowed or anything?
I don't think they plow it, but generally the snow melts it. I've walked through there all through the winter, and only when it was thick snow did I not do that. You can snowshoe or cross-country ski if you want. Any other questions from our Zoom followers?
Not at this time.
Okay.
Other questions from the
Okay, thank you, everybody.
group?